The first thing the Vethra took was not the weapons caches, not the orbital defense platforms, not the communication arrays, or the water treatment plants, or the fusion cores buried beneath the mountain ranges of the northern provinces. They took those too, eventually, with the cold, methodical patience of a species that had been conquering worlds for 11,000 years. But the screens came first. Every monitor, every projector, every handheld device, with a display capable of rendering moving images. The Vethra understood, in their long-boned, multi-chambered heart way, that a conquered people who could still tell themselves stories were not truly conquered at all. Mara Osi was 34 years old when the occupation began, and she had spent the previous 11 years running a community cinema out of a converted grain warehouse in the lowland city of Kerte. 300 seats, a salvaged analog projector she'd rebuilt from parts, and a rotating program of films she'd accumulated across a decade of obsessive collecting. She'd screened everything from pre-contact Martian colony dramas to the Great Flood of Earth documentaries, from The Warming Decades to the quiet domestic comedies that had briefly flourished on Proxima Ceti before the trade routes collapsed. Films from 100 human worlds. Films about failure and patience and love and the specific human genius for finding something beautiful in whatever wreckage was at hand. She watched the Vethra soldiers move through Kirti in their pressure-sealed carapace armor, 8 feet of gray-plated authority, their bioluminescent markings cycling slowly through the amber to violet spectrum that she would later learn indicated administrative function. They were not cruel, not in any obvious way. They did not burn or beat, they catalogued, they tagged, they confiscated. They issued occupation directives in a translation frequency that human auditory organs could pass, and the directives were specific: no unauthorized gatherings above 12 persons, no transmission of audiovisual content on any frequency, all image projection equipment to be surrendered to the nearest collection depot within 72 standard hours. Mara watched them come down her street. She had approximately 4 hours. She spent the first hour moving the projector. She and her brother Dek dismantled it into its 17 subcomponents and distributed them across the false bottom of a drainage channel that ran beneath the warehouse's rear foundation. It had taken her 9 months to build. It took them 62 minutes to hide. The films took longer. She had over 800 physical reels and nearly 3,000 digital files on isolated storage cores. She could not save everything. She sat in the projection booth with her brother and her neighbor Sana, who managed the building's electrical systems, and she made choices she would carry for the rest of her life. The early Earth documentaries, the Proxima comedies, the war record from the Kepler incident that she had obtained at considerable personal cost, and which she suspected was the only surviving copy. A set of children's animations from a culture that no longer existed. She filled 3 weatherproof cases, and they went into the drainage channel with the projector parts. The rest she watched the soldiers take. The Vethra collection team was efficient. 2 soldiers, 1 data clerk in lighter armor, a wheeled transport drone. They tagged the reels with barcoded adhesive strips, loaded them into sealed containers, issued her a receipt. She stared at it after they left. It had a 16-digit code that she supposed theoretically corresponded to her property somewhere in the Vethra administrative database. She folded it twice and put it in her coat pocket and stood in the empty projection booth for a long time. Listening to the particular quality of silence a room develops when the things that gave it meaning have been removed. She thought about a documentary she had screened 18 months before the occupation. A film from old Earth about a woman in another country under another kind of control, who had kept a theater running in secret for 22 years. The woman in the film had talked about the difference between fear and despair. How fear was a natural condition of survival, something the body generated because it understood the stakes. But despair was a choice you made, a story you decided to believe about what was possible. She had screened that film on a Tuesday. Attendance had been 11 people. She had not thought about it much at the time. She thought about it now. The occupation settled into its forms. Kerti became a Vethra administrative zone, one of 47 across the continent. The new protocols governed movement, commerce, communication. The Vethra were not particularly interested in what humans ate or how they organized their households, or what they said to each other in private conversation. They had studied enough occupied species to know that micromanagement of private life produced resentment at an efficiency that outpaced any benefit. What they wanted was compliance at the structural level. No organized resistance, no communications that could coordinate dissent across zones, no cultural production that might galvanize collective identity. The screens were a precise and clinical solution to a problem they had solved before. What they did not account for, what 11,000 years of conquest had apparently not taught them, was the specific human relationship with darkness and projection and the desire to gather. Mara waited 4 months before she ran her first screening. She chose an agricultural storage building 3 kilometers outside the city boundary, where the Vethra monitoring infrastructure was thinner and the human population had learned to move in ways that looked, from above, like routine farm labor. She reassembled the projector over the course of 2 weeks, working by touch in a sub-basement with no light source except the small phosphorescent strips she'd salvaged from safety equipment. She ran test frames against a whitewashed wall. The image was slightly warped from the reassembly, a persistent lean to the left that she compensated for by shimming the projection lens housing with a folded strip of aluminum. The first audience was 19 people. She had promised herself she would not run more than 15. 16 was the limit where Vethra pattern recognition, from what she had been able to piece together from occupation directives and observed enforcement behavior, began to flag a gathering as potentially organized. 19 was a failure of discipline, and she knew it, and she showed the film anyway. She screened a Proxima comedy, 80 minutes about 3 siblings arguing over the inheritance of their dead father's greenhouse. Nothing political, nothing about resistance or collective action or the human capacity for defiance. Just 3 people who loved each other badly and couldn't say it, and a greenhouse full of plants that kept dying because no one could agree on the watering schedule, and an ending that resolved nothing but somehow, despite itself, felt like hope. Halfway through, she heard crying. She couldn't see who it was in the dark. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on the image, that particular quality of light moving, alive, and she thought, there it is. That's why they took the screens first. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were still wrong about whether it would work. The operation grew with the specific logic of things that meet a genuine need. Deck handled logistics, finding locations, vetting attendees, managing the physical distribution of film canisters through a chain of 6 trusted intermediaries who never knew more than one link in the sequence. Sana reverse-engineered Vethra monitoring frequencies over 18 months of patient, pernicious work, mapping the gaps and the patterns, learning when the surveillance density dropped and for how long. A woman named Petra, who had been an electrician before the occupation and was now classified as an agricultural laborer, figured out how to draw power from the Vethra infrastructure without creating the draw signatures that their systems flagged for investigation. A man named Ibra, whose previous life had been spent trading commodity futures across the zone networks, built a scheduling and communication system out of verbal code embedded in market day conversations. None of them had trained for this. None of them had planned for this. They were a cinema operator, a building manager, an electrician, and a commodities trader who had found themselves, through the specific accident of occupation and the specific fact of what Mara had hidden in a drainage channel, in possession of something the Vethra wanted erased. They ran screenings every 3 to 4 weeks, rotating locations, never the same building twice in sequence, never the same route. Attendance averaged between 20 and 30 people. They screened whatever Mara had managed to save, comedies, documentaries, dramas, the animated children's films that the adults watched in the heaviest silence of all. They screened the war record from the Kepler incident twice, at the request of several attendees who wanted to see it again, who said it helped them remember what human beings were capable of when they decided they were not going to simply accept what was being done to them. The Vethra came close twice in the first year. The first time, a patrol passed within 200 meters of an active screening location. SANA's frequency mapping held. The patrol's monitoring equipment registered nothing, and the patrol continued on its route, while 31 people sat in the dark inside a barn and watched a mother and daughter reconcile across 40 years of misunderstanding. The second time, an informant, or someone who had been pressured into providing information, Mara never knew which, and did not allow herself to think about it for long, gave the Vethra a partial location and a general time window. The screening had ended 20 minutes before the soldiers arrived. They found an empty building and a whitewashed wall, and nothing else. The installation team had been efficient. They'd had a lot of practice. After the second close call, there was a meeting. 5 people in a root cellar, 1 small light, everyone understanding the stakes in the particular clear way that proximity to discovery clarifies things. "We should stop," said Ibra. He did not sound afraid when he said it. He sounded like a man who was making a reasonable assessment of risk and wanted it acknowledged before he was overruled. Mara thought about the woman from the documentary, the one who had kept a theater running for 22 years. She thought about the specific word the woman had used: despair, not fear. Despair is a choice. "We should be more careful," Mara said, "and we should keep going." Ibra nodded. He had expected that answer. She suspected he had wanted it. They kept going. The second year of occupation brought new complications and new possibilities. A Vethra administrative restructuring shifted monitoring resources away from the agricultural periphery toward the urban core, where a different kind of resistance, louder, more visible, more in line with the Vethra evidently expected from occupied species, had begun to emerge. It cost them monitoring bandwidth. Mara's operation inherited the gap. They began receiving external material. She still was not sure, years later, how the first package arrived. It appeared in a drop location that only 4 people knew about, wrapped in Vethra standard agricultural supply packaging containing 18 digital storage cores and a slip of paper with a set of coordinates and a single sentence in a handwriting she did not recognize. There are others. The cores contained films. Films she had never seen. Films from worlds she had not known produced films. An animated series from a human settlement on a tidally locked moon, where the sun never moved, and the stories were all about the things that stayed the same, and the small ways that sameness could become its own kind of warmth. A documentary from a deep space mining operation about the specific culture that develops among people who spend years in enclosed spaces and must learn to live with each other's full humanity, whether they want to or not. A collection of short films made by children on a generation ship, shot on equipment salvaged from storage, featuring that inventive technical decorations that produces surprising beauty. Someone, somewhere, was doing what she was doing. Multiple someones. She sat with that knowledge for several days before she could articulate why it mattered so much. It wasn't strategic. Knowing that others were operating similar networks didn't make her network safer, and in fact created new risk if any of those networks were compromised and began to unravel. The knowledge was not practically useful. It mattered because of something she had learned from 11 years of running a cinema. Stories need to be shared to be real. A film screened for 1 person in an empty room is an experience. A film screened for 30 people in the dark with the sound of other people breathing, the sense of their presence and their attention, and their small involuntary reactions. That is something the film could not have been alone. The story completes itself in the sharing, and knowing that this was happening elsewhere, on other worlds, under other versions of the same boot, that the desire for this, the need for it, was not something the Vethra could eliminate by confiscating screens, meant something she did not have precise language for but understood completely. The Vethra understood it too, which was why they kept trying. In the third year, they sent a specialist, not a soldier, not an administrative team, a specialist in human cultural suppression. Mara learned this later from records accessed after the occupation ended. A Vethra functionary, whose classification roughly translated as pattern analyst. Someone trained to look for the specific signatures of organized cultural resistance in species where the Vethra had learned that culture was the substrate in which resistance grew. His name, translated into human phoneme ranges, was something like Vek or Mas. He had performed this function on 6 previous occupied worlds. He was, by the standards of his species, extremely good at what he did. He began by mapping absences, not what was happening, but what wasn't. Sectors of the population that showed lower than expected psychological distress markers. Anomalies in the social cohesion metrics the Vethra measured through behavioral surveillance. Groups of humans who, by all indicators, should have been exhibiting the fragmentation and mutual withdrawal that the Vethra expected from populations under cultural suppression, but who were instead maintaining Fintoko bonds at a rate that didn't fit the model. He narrowed it to 3 agricultural zones outside Kerte. He established a surveillance perimeter. He was patient. 11,000 years of institutional experience had produced patience as a species trait. They could wait. Sana noticed the new monitoring signature 8 days before Vekor Mas closed in on his first location. She could not identify what it was. It was unlike the standard Vethra surveillance frequencies she had spent 18 months mapping, but she recognized what it was not, and not being standard was enough. She flagged it. They suspended operations for 6 weeks. When they resumed, they had changed everything: routes, locations, timing patterns, the communication system, the intermediary chain. It cost them 2 months of preparation and the loss of 3 locations that had been carefully built up over the previous year. It cost them that. What it did not cost them was the projector or the films. Vekor Mas spent 4 months looking for something that had been moved before he arrived. He filed reports indicating low confidence in his hypothesis. He was reassigned. After he left, Mara ran a screening in the agricultural storage building 3 kilometers outside the city boundary. The first location, the original one, which she had not used in over a year. 38 people, the largest audience yet. She screened the Kepler incident war record, and then she screened the animated series from the tidally locked moon, and the dark room full of people breathing together, held both things at once. The record of what humans had survived and the art humans made from the long, unchanging light. In the 4th year, the occupation began to change. Not because of anything Mara's network did directly. The change came from the political dimension, from diplomatic pressures and the long, grinding work of the people who had been doing the visible resistance that she had always understood was a different and equally necessary thing. The Vethra were not losing exactly, but the terms of the occupation were shifting in ways that their administrative calculus registered as increasingly costly. There were concessions. There were withdrawals. There were long periods of negotiation that produced nothing, and then, unexpectedly, something. The screens came back gradually in specific categories and specific restrictions: educational content, agricultural information, administrative directives, nothing that could be classified as narrative fiction. Mara watched this happen and understood it exactly. They were still trying. They would keep trying. The screens they gave back were a controlled release of pressure that they calculated would reduce resistance to a manageable level. They had the data from 6 previous occupied worlds after all. They knew how to calibrate this. What the data from 6 previous occupied worlds could not account for was what was happening in the root cellar network, the barn network, the drainage channel with the projector parts, the 18 storage cores that had arrived in Vethra agricultural packaging from someone's she had never met. Because the thing about stories, is that they go places their tellers cannot follow. By the end of the 4th year, Mara estimated, conservatively, based only on the networks she had direct knowledge of, that the films she had saved in those 72 hours had been screened for somewhere between 12 and 15,000 people. Films from before the occupation, films that arrived through routes she still did not fully understand, films that people had begun making themselves on salvaged and improvised equipment, on Vethra surplus imaging devices repurposed, for outputs their designers had not intended. Short films, long films, films about what it was like to live in Kerte under occupation, which were also films about what it was like to be human, which were also films that she suspected would matter to people who had not been born yet and who would inherit whatever came next. The thing the Vethra had not been able to calculate. The screens they took were the screens they knew about. The screens they didn't know about, the desire for them, the human tendency to construct them from whatever was available, from whitewash walls and salvaged lenses and root cellar darkness and the irreducible seed to sit next to a person and watch something move and feel. In Nut, those screens they could not confiscate because they did not exist yet. They came into being in the act of the attempt to create them. They lived in the gesture toward them. The formal withdrawal of Vethra forces from Kerte occurred on a Tuesday. Mara was there for it. She was there for the announcement, the lowering of the administrative flags, the long, strange silence that followed. She stood street with Dek and Sana and Petra and Ibra, and they did not say anything for a while. There was not much to say. It felt too large for the words they had available. That evening, she reassembled the projector in the warehouse. She did not fix the lean. She had grown fond of it, the slight warp in the image, the leftward drift, the evidence of repair and improvisation, and the fact that the thing was still working after everything. She hung a white sheet at the end of the warehouse floor because the original screen had not come back. 312 people came, more standing in the back and along the walls than seats could hold. She screened the children's animations from the culture that no longer existed. She had saved them 4 years ago and had screened them many times since, but not here, not in this room, not with this many people. She watched the images move on the white sheet, small figures in impossible colors, going about the business of a world that had ended, carrying within them the trace of every person who had made them and every person who had ever watched them. And she thought about what it meant that they were still here, that they had survived not by being hidden in a vault somewhere or deemed significant by an archival institution, but by being watched, by being shared, by the completely ordinary and completely irreplaceable act of people in the dark, together looking at something that moved. The Vethra had understood one thing correctly: a conquered people who could still tell themselves stories were not truly conquered. What they had not understood was the corollary. A people who could still tell themselves stories, who preserved the impulse and the infrastructure and the simple human insistence on sitting together in the dark, were not conquerable in any way that counted. You could take the screens, you could not take the need that made the screens necessary. That need would find its form. It always did. It had been finding its form for as long as humans had been human, in every dark space that could hold a story and an audience, from painted cave walls to stolen projection booths to whitewashed barns 3 kilometers outside a city under occupation. The figures moved on the sheet. The room was full of people breathing. Mara put her hand in her coat pocket and found, still folded twice, the receipt the Vethra had given her for her confiscated films. She did not look at it. She watched the screen and she stayed.